Welcome back to Geography 321. Today we are going to do something slightly different. We're going to talk about the Andes, the mountain range that runs through the entire western spine of South America, but we will talk about it in the context of pictures that I've taken in the last 4 or 5 years in my work and travel in that region. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a map just to clarify the region that we're looking at here. We are looking at this very prolific mountain range that stretches all the way from the Caribbean. You can see this in the brown color on the western side of the map here. And this mountain range extends all the way into Patagonia, or the tip of South America. The highest peak in the Andes is in Peru, and it's at about 22,000 feet. So this mountain range is not quite as prolific as something like the Himalaya in South Asia, but it is the largest mountain range in the Western Hemisphere with some of the most prolific peaks. The Andes mountain chain widens the most in Bolivia, that you can see in the middle of the map here. And the Andes moderate climate to a great extent in South America. So if you are at high altitude in the Andes, you can bet that if you're anywhere off of the equator, which is you see running right through Ecuador, you can bet that it's extremely cold. And one of the things to point out about the Andes, these really high peaks and the people who live in this mountain range, is that this is a really hard place to live. It's a hard life, it's a very isolated life, and you could say that culturally it shapes the character of people. Andean people tend to be very tough and hardy people, and they live in pretty extreme environments, and they oftentimes live in poverty. This picture was taken of the Andean mountain range just outside of Cusco in Peru. This is another picture that's near Ollantaytambo in Peru. And before we go any further, I want to tell you that I'm going to mention a lot of names today. You need to memorize none of them. Just kind of relax, and the part that you need to sort of understand is the part later when we talk about change and culture and a lot of the things that are taking place there now. This is an example of the hardship that people live. So this is a very small community at about 16 or 17,000 feet. At this altitude, oxygen gets very thin and it becomes very difficult to breathe. And people who live at this altitude tend to chew a lot of coca. A lot of you may know of coca as the precursor to cocaine. Coca is a plant. It's like a woody shrub that grows in the Andes as they descend into the Amazon. And you can process coca into cocaine, but cocaine is only one property of the coca plant. And what local people in the Andes use coca for is they chew it in their mouth. And coca is used because it gives people a little bit of energy and it helps them digest carbohydrates. And this is a very carbohydrate heavy diet at this altitude. And it also contains a lot of calcium. And calcium is very important for women who don't really have access to livestock and milk living at this altitude. And it contains a lot of vitamins and a lot of nutritional support. So it's a very interesting plant, but it is the plant that can be used to produce cocaine. One thing you should understand when you see people chewing coca, though, is that they're not doing a drug. It would take a room full of coca to be processed and create a line of cocaine. It's a very different kind of property, and I would associate it more with maybe having green tea or coffee. I would say it's not even as strong as coffee, but it helps a lot with altitude sickness, or what's called soroche at altitude. And so a lot of local people chew it. This is a picture of Cusco. Cusco is a very important city that is in Peru, and some people call it sort of a cultural capital unofficially of the Andes. It's a historic area, and it's well known for its Incan walls that were built before Spanish colonialism. And it was one of the real centers of the Incan Empire for the short and prolific time that it existed. This is a picture of one of the cathedrals in the downtown plaza. This is a picture at night. Cusco is great as a city because it has these very narrow, wandering alleyways that go in and out of the hills. And in the daytime, you can see actual Incan walls, or walls that were constructed during the Incan Empire. And the Inca were experts at creating these walls. On the bottom right side, you can see what craftsmanship they had and how exact these walls are. And the finest examples of Incan architecture are such that you could take a piece of paper and you could barely stick it between these stones. The picture on the top left side is a picture of Incan walls that were built over by the Spanish. And what the Spanish would do is they would very badly, as you can see, create Spanish walls on top of very important Incan sites. So if it was a religious or a sacred site for the Inca, you would bet that the Spanish would go and they would destroy its foundation and they would build their own stones on top of the Incan walls simply as a way to subjugate them and as a form of domination. And they would build Catholic churches on top of sacred Incan sites. There's an old joke in Peru that you'll hear very often, that the wall on the bottom is created by the Inca and the wall on the top is created by the incapable. Cusco is a town with a lot of cultural celebrations, and you frequently see these in the downtown plaza nearly every day. It's one of these places in Latin America, and there are several that exist like this, but it's one of these places where any day you show up, any time of the year, you're likely to see some kind of cultural or religious celebration. And this one, these men carry this incredibly large and heavy float, and they almost fall several times, and it lists back and forth, and you can see the conductor in the front looking towards the finish line with real worry. And it's kind of a disconcerting thing to see, because these guys look like they're going to buckle under the pressure, but somehow they make it. And I suppose they do it as a kind of form of devotion or to show their strength, but it's perilous, and I wouldn't want to be one of these cars standing next to this thing as it passed by. People in Cusco oftentimes come from outside provinces and different villages, and one of the interesting things about the Andes is that different villages have different forms of dress, different kinds of hats, different kinds of ponchos, for example. And for a person who's from Cusco or from the villages that surround Cusco, you could tell where people are coming from based on their clothing and their style of poncho and their style of hats. This was during a celebration. I don't recommend driving around like this at home, but it's just an example of something that you see pretty frequently, cars going through the plaza celebrating with some kind of megaphone on top, blasting some commercial or some kind of religious message during a festival. Peru is one of these countries in Latin America that has really good food, and I took a few pictures here. This is obviously corn, but Peruvian gastronomy is very strong. It has a lot of influences. It's had a lot of migration from Asia, and many people make the claim that fusion food was born in Peru, and there's a pretty good argument for that. Mexico is the other place that I mentioned a week or two back in terms of having really excellent food, but of the top 10 restaurants in 2015 in the world, the only one that was located in Latin America was located in Lima, the capital of Peru. So it's very good food. This is trout, or trucha a la plancha, which just means it's a form of trout. It comes from the river that's nearby and very simply cooked, but very delicious. Peru is also famous for its seemingly endless variety of potatoes. There are a few thousand different varieties of potatoes, and in the Andes, especially for poor people, they really depend on this as a food source.